And I would like to start, like some of my fellow presenters have before me really, in thanking BILD and all of you as part of that for a really warm welcome. I suppose a lot of my work is in critical disability studies and is within the kind of autism community. And in both those camps, there's some kind of tensions around positive behaviour support. So when I said I was coming, and I'm usually oblivious to all these tensions. I go along in my own little world and think everything is lovely. So when I said I was coming to the conference to speak, a few people were going, ooh, positive behaviour support, or be careful there, Nick. So I thought, oh my gosh, what are you all going to be like? I was starting to get a little bit anxious. So I was really relieved to get here and find how lovely you are. And the way that, I suppose the way that I've been shown a warm welcome is the fact that people have made me feel valued and cared for. People have been prepared to come and speak to me. People have provided me with a lovely room, in which case, I think I must live a very simple life, because I walked in and I went, ooh. And then I could see the water. I was, ooh. Well, they'd really got me when the lady at the desk said, "You've got an executive room." I thought, yes. It's all I needed really to feel cared for and valued. And the food has been lovely. And I've had a kind of timetable, so I've known what's coming. BILD have thrown a few things at me, like they changed my time. Oh, I was a bit unnerved by that. They added an extra 15 minutes. That threw me. That's why I'm giving you such a long kind of preamble. Yeah. And then they let me know just before I came that I would have a video interview. You couldn't tell me anything worse. And normally I'd need a year to prepare myself for that. But because everything else was okay, I was all right with that. And so I think it just, all of, Nigel was saying earlier about all these things that happen to us can help us reflect really on what we do and who we are and what we're about really. And I think it really made me wonder is about the people that we're concerned about, many of whom, because many of you work with adults, my particular focus is mainly around children and young people. But how many of those feel cared for? How many feel valued? I'll mention later the great Herb Lovett, who was an American psychologist who was taken from us far too young in a car crash. And I'm sure many of you will probably have heard Herb speak or have read his work. But Herb didn't mess about really, and he would go into case study reviews and he would say, right, okay, what are the issues here? And it would be, maybe it would be an adult, maybe with autism, maybe with learning difficulties, where staff were at their wits' end as they saw it about this person's behaviour. So the staff would all go round and they would list all the problems that arose from this person. And then when they're finished, Herb would sometimes say, and who here loves this person? And I imagine that must have had such a powerful impact that it must have made people stop and think about, where does this person get love from outside of their family? Where do they feel valued? Where do they feel, who is speaking up for them? Who is their advocate here? Who cares what happens to them? And I just think, I always used to think in my own work, is so I've worked at Sheffield Hallam University since 1998, and I work in the autism centre there primarily. And before that, I was a teacher in a variety of schools, mainly with children with autism for 15 years. And one of the things that I always tried to do, wherever I worked, I was very lucky early on in my career. I went to work at Sutherland House School, which in the kind of 1980s in Nottingham was a very forward-thinking, groundbreaking school for children with autism. And the reason it was groundbreaking primarily was because it was starting to think about what's the view of the children on what's happening here. How do they feel about what we're doing? What meaning does it have for them? How motivating is it for them? What sense are they making of it? And is this how they want things to be? And soon after I started working there, people like Donna Williams and Temple Grandin started to write about their experiences as autistic people. And that was still a real shock for a lot of us. A lot of us were like, people with autism can reflect on their experiences. They can actually have a view on what we're doing. They might be uncomfortable by what I'm doing. They might be feeling about it. Because before that, the mantra was that people with autism learn by doing. That basically, they have very little sense about the world, that they're not going to be able to offer any opinion about it. So you just have to make people do things, and once they realise what's involved, they'll be okay about it. And so, if you were to go swimming, then if you wanted someone to learn to swim, even if they were maybe 19 years old, 20 years old, they hadn't swum before, you push them in. And then they'd have to get on with it. So if they were kind of backing off by the water, if they were demonstrating what of course was fear, uncertainty, you just push them in. And when I went to work at Sutherland House, we had a great colleague there, a lifelong friend now, Carol Hamilton. And she was taking a little boy with autism in the class swimming. And she'd start off with him just going to see the building, and then she'd come back. And then when he was comfortable with that, she'd go a bit near and they'd look at the pool through the door. And I used to say to her, oh, for goodness sake, I'm going to sound like a monster. I'll be like, pick him up, chuck him in. Like, because that's how I was used to things being done, really. And Carol was great. She was like, no, Nick, you know, he'll come to it in his own time. School is a place where he should feel safe. He should feel secure. He should feel relaxed enough to be able to learn. School isn't a site of fear and tension. And so I think that kind of really resonated with me. And you know, when people tell you things like that, it really kind of, some things suddenly make sense to you. It's like someone takes the blinkers off and you think, how did I never know that before? So, and I think, so even before, because one of the things I try and do, because I work a lot in autism, I'll talk about autism, but I use, everything I say about autism applies to everybody who doesn't identify with that label, everybody without autism. A big part of my role is about despecializing the notion. I'm trying to take the specialness out of autism and just look at people. My idea will be is if we just looked at learners and we just said, wow, who are you? Like, how is it to be you in the world? What's that like? What are your aspirations? What do you want to achieve? What do you like doing? Like, how do I need to present things for you to enable you to access them and learn? So, and some of you who have heard me speak before will know I go off in my own little reveries and I completely forget the point that I was making about that. But I kind of come back to it at some point. So I have there completely forgotten why I'd started that story. Oh yeah, because it took me back. That when I did one of my teacher training placements, was in an infant school in Bristol. And it was in Knowle West, which was quite a kind of challenged area. And the teacher I was assigned with was a vicar's wife. And I always kind of describe her like that, but I'm not quite sure why I do. I think for me it perhaps carried a whole set of assumptions. So if there are any vicars' wives here, or vicars, and you kind of think there's something derogatory about that, I apologise. It's not intended. But she had, for me, an interesting way of doing it, of going about things, really. Because she would say, whenever it was drinks time, she'd get out a tablecloth. And she would kind of like put it over the table, and there would be a rule, no milk bottles on the table. And I remember when Elsie Tanner in Coronation Street used to put the milk bottle on the table, my mum used to say, "Oh, how common." So I kind of, I was with her on that. I thought, yeah, standards. And she'd look at me and she'd say, "Nick, I know what you're thinking." She said, "I know that you're thinking that these children won't necessarily have a tablecloth at home." She said, "That's not necessarily kind of part of their life, and it's like bringing in a different set of values?" And she said, "Well, if it is," she said, "I feel school should be about coming into contact with different ways of doing things. Not to say it's a better way, but just to say that maybe you want to make a choice. Maybe you want to decide for yourself whether you're a tablecloth person or whether you're not really, whether you have the milk bottle on the table or whether you don't." And there was a little boy in that class who I'll call Nigel, because he was trouble. But so one part of my thing was to get Nigel to read every day. And each day I would say, "Nigel, go and get your book." And Nigel would say, "Oh, I haven't got my book. And I'd say, "You've not got your book again. You've forgotten it again." And he'd say, yeah, I've forgotten it again. So every day this went on. And then one day I happened to be standing past him when he opened his tray, and inside the tray was the book. So I went ballistic, in my very horrible way, and said some unpleasant things to him within the remit of what's kind of allowed in schools. And so the teacher took me to one side, and she said, "Why do you think he's telling you, Nick, that he's not got his book?" And I said, "Because he's a lying little toad." And she went, "No, Nick, I don't think that maybe is the reason." She said, "I wonder if he's afraid. I wonder if he's anxious about his abilities to read. I wonder if he's kind of nervous about being shown up." And so I immediately went from thinking about the lying little toad to, oh, bless. I wanted to make his life better. And I wanted to make him more confident about reading. And I wanted to do that in a way that didn't threaten him or didn't put him on the spot. And so what that teacher was getting me to do was to think about him as a human being, to think about him as a person, not just some almost like an object that I had to make do certain things so that it would produce the outcomes by which I would be judged. I had to really think about this person and them being them in the world, really. And that's kind of been invaluable to me. And I think our own Nigel kind of said something today about, I have to warn you, this presentation, there are slides. And I put them together really carefully. I do think about you and I think, oh, BILD have invested in me, I must return it, I must be good, I must behave, I have to kind of pay that back. So I really kind of think about it, and and the standard of presentations has been so high, I thought, oh God, I must practice it again. And so I'll practice it for half an hour to see how long it lasts. And then I think, oh, I'm boring myself to death. I'll make a cup of tea and come back to it. And when I come back, the timer thing is then 1 hour 20 or something. I think, oh, I'm completely lost now. But the trouble is I forget. As soon as I've done them, I forget what I've put on the slides. I don't seem to have any ability to remember them. So just trust me that I've got messages in my head that I think this is about, and we will kind of get there at some point. And hopefully I've now used up my extra 15 minutes, so we should go on. And more, okay. But I was thinking today, because Nigel was saying about how all sorts of things can spark off. You can learn from all sorts of situations, really. And I learned an awful lot from so many of the presentations, but I learned a lot from George's. And one of the things that I learned from George's was probably not what George intended particularly. But when that kind of presentation started, I'd sat myself in the middle of the room, which I wouldn't normally do. I'd normally kind of sit on the aisle, but I'd seen Brent, and I thought, I'll go and say hello to Brent, and I sat next to Brent. And about kind of 6 minutes into George's presentation, I thought, oh no, I need to go to the loo. This is like why I never sit in the middle. I need to go to the loo. And so Alan soon after saved my life, because he said, George, just 10 minutes to go. And George said, really, really, really? And then George said, but I've got an hour to go. And I thought, oh no, I really enjoyed the presentation, but I can't last an hour. So I thought, what could I do? What could I do? And so this is it, like, I'm then getting in a panic. And I looked at Brent and I thought, well, I know Brent now a bit. I could punch him. I could start a fight so we both get taken out, because it was too embarrassing for me to say, excuse me, you know, I know I've only been sitting here 6 minutes, but I've got to go out. And I thought, well, gosh, no. I thought, oh dear, BILD wouldn't be very pleased about me causing a fight and being taken out. But I said, oh, but I could say it was Brent's fault. And then I sat there and I thought, and it was really interesting because there was a lady sat next to me who I didn't know at all, so I never thought about punching her. So there was something about the kind of knowing Brent. And I thought, well, anyway, I thought that would be a bit mean. I thought they wouldn't invite Brent anymore. He'd be blacklisted on the conference circuit. But I thought, well, that would be a good thing, really, because then I wouldn't bump into him and be embarrassed. So I then decided, no, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't punch Brent. It was just too traumatic. I was like rational enough still to keep a hold of it. So I thought, what should I do? What should I do? And I thought, oh, I know. I'll keep drinking water. So I kind of, because my first instinct, and George, like, it's like you knew my habits. When you were given examples of habits, I thought that's me. As soon as there's any kind of stress or anything, shove something in your mouth, really. And those laughing, I hope you're not thinking what I think you're thinking. But I was meaning, and I know this looks a bit like a breast as well, but actually I was raised on a bottle. But I was just thinking, so what I was thinking about was I thought, oh, yeah, I could imagine the whole kind of case review that would be going on about me when the staff would all get round together and my support workers would be saying, oh, he was just sitting next to Brent and he gets on well with Brent, he just hit him for no reason. And Herb Lovett always says, behaviour doesn't happen, as you know. Behaviour doesn't happen for no reason. I think, is that a double negative? That gets a bit confusing. Behaviour, there's always a reason for behaviour. It's just sometimes, like, in my stress state, it would have been difficult to follow my line of reasoning if I didn't articulate it. And I can imagine the support workers saying, and anyway, when Nick wet himself, he did it deliberately. I saw him keep drinking water, so no wonder it happened. So it's all about, so I suppose my work is all about trying to work with schools to get them to look at things differently. And I thought, well, actually, I should find out how to do this. I suppose you press the one that says next and a big green button. I don't even probably have to point it anywhere specifically. Oh, gosh, you do. I can't work my telly. If my partner, the lovely Andrew, isn't home, I have to just sit there staring at some blank screen, yeah. So, all right, this is what this presentation is going to be about. So, allegedly, really. So one of the things I want to do, so this came about when you're an academic and you kind of work with schools, you're very privileged that, well, I used to get, bless you, used to get invited into schools, but I don't so much now because they say I always turn it into a story. And it's always a critical story, but like I have to say that I'm not trying to be critical. I'm trying to be critical about, but not critical of, teachers' practice. And because I was a teacher for so many years, I still feel like a teacher. And I still kind of stress myself about things I did, really. But you get invited into schools, and sometimes you're there for a big event like this, where lots of people come, parents and carers come, all the staff coming in, and this might be in a special school, and so all the children will be brought in. And you have time to sit back and just watch. Like when you're teaching, you don't. You're just corralling people. You're just keeping everybody where you think they should be. You don't have time to reflect. And so there'd been a change of plan. We were all meant to be at an event outside, but because of the great British weather, it had all turned sour. So we all had to come inside. And so there was a lot of people in quite a confined space. All the children came in. Some children would see their parents and would be trying to get to see their parents, and people would be pulling them away. So the parents would be getting kind of stressed about it. The children were stressed. The staff were stressed. So I was thinking, wow, this doesn't feel quite the celebratory event I think that was intended. But I saw one child come in, and I've got when I was, Andy had heard me present before, and I was talking to Andy, who's down here, and he said, Nick, he said, you don't want to be behind that desk thing. He said, you need to be free. You like to move around. And I went, yes, I do, Andy. I want to be free. What can I do about it? And he said, well, you can get a radio mic. He said, George had one. So I thought, right, okay, I'm gonna have one. But now I'm worried I'm gonna fall over, Andy, off the end. So I saw this young lad come in who was about 8, and he was with the group of children as they all came in, and the staff were shepherding them about. And he saw something that captured his interest, and he wandered across the room to it. And I saw the staff member who was kind of talking to her colleagues as she went. She came over, and she just took his arm, and she started to move back with him to where she wanted to be. But he stopped where he was. So I took an intake of breath, because I thought, somebody's arm is going to come out of the socket. I thought somebody's going to get hurt here. But he just came when she pulled again, and they went off together, and no one was hurt. But I was really aware that this school was very proud of its record of recording positive handling incidents. So positive handling, as many of you know, comes from kind of like a sort of team teach approach, where if you have to restrain a child in any way, then that's handling, really. They're being handled. And I know that this school is really kind of hot, and they report on all their statistics. They say we did 3 positive handlings last week, and 12 children have been positively handled. It's like a phrase that's used a lot. And I thought, well, I haven't actually seen anybody really looking at what happened. And I don't see anybody running off to get a form or anybody writing it in a notebook. So I thought, this then isn't being conceptualized as a handling incident. And if it's not a handling incident, when you put your hand on someone and you physically move them, then I thought maybe I'm not clear about what handling is really. And Sarah Leach had heard me talking about this before, and was saying that now when she goes to visit places, she's like really sensitive to it, and she sees it in so many places. And I was visiting schools recently, and you see all sorts of things. Like I saw it was a special class in a mainstream school for children with autism, young children, and I saw a lad. They were doing a matching exercise. So he put his hand on the table to take the card, and then he went to take his hand away because he decided not to take the card. And the teacher, in a very gentle way, that it's often done with the best intentions, held his hand there. So he was kind of trapped really, because she didn't want him to suddenly disappear. She wanted him to take the card. And she would have had all the pressures of me sitting there staring. She could probably see it going through my mind. Handling, you're handling. Yeah, you're not reporting it, you're handling. So I could see all these kind of tensions for her. But again, I thought that was handling. And then in the same class, another lad came in. And I was kind of, you kind of think, don't you? Sometimes I think, right, okay, what would they be happy for me to share and what wouldn't? So I'll leave that one. But this child came in. I'm not telling you the bit I shouldn't tell you about. I suddenly thought, when you're being videoed, you think, oh, I don't know where it'll go. Who will see it? They'll arrive at my doorstep saying. So, so the lad came in and the teacher wanted him to do something and he started to move away and he had a lot of sensory stimulation activity. So the teacher picked him up and was swinging him round. And I thought, oh, she's done that deliberately for me to be really troubled by, is that handling or is that not handling? Because the child was like enjoying it and loving it, but basically it was about, you're electing to go away, but I want you to be here and I'm using my body to contain you. And what I want to do with schools is not to say, I don't think you should do that, or I think you should do this, is I want us to kind of reflect really and to think about these issues. And at about the same time, I was really kind of wanting to do something around the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, because that was such an important document, the first convention of the millennium, and the first convention ever, as far as I'm aware, that was actually devised and put together by the very people that it was going to impact on, disabled people, through their organisations. So I was really interested in what do we mean by rights, and why don't I hear people talking about rights in schools particularly? And Beth did a fantastic presentation on about how to really use kind of these international treaties, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, to really make a difference to children's lives, really. So what I wanted to do, what a big part of my work is to, I've put a picture up there because I know visuals aren't accessible for everybody, it's lovely Tanya Tichkowski, who's a university professor in University of Toronto, who kind of works in disability studies. And Tanya talks about this idea of a politics of wonder, where you make uncertainty out of what is certain. So what I'm trying to do with schools really is to just get conversations going about what do we think, something that we think we know what positive handling is. That's a certainty for us. We know when we do positive handling and when we don't. I want us to take a politics of wonder and say, well, actually, let's look at that a different way. Let's think about it differently. Let's throw out some definitions of handling. What about this incident? Do we actually think that is handling or not? So I want people to think about that and to think about rights, really. And poor George, I'm picking on him more than Brent, really, but like George spoke yesterday about the importance of going back to fundamentals. And I think that's really interesting, but you can only go back to your fundamentals if you know what your fundamentals are. And Thomas Skritic, who's, he has a lovely title. I didn't know this title existed. Well, funnily enough, didn't know it existed till recently. He's Distinguished Professor of Special Education at the University of Kansas. And then Sandra, today I noticed, was a Distinguished Fellow. So I shall be going back to my university and having a few conversations. Now I found out about that. But Skritic, I'm a real admirer of Thomas Skritic's work. And he says that the act of choosing a frame of reference has profound moral and political implications for individuals and society. So it's so important that we know what we do, why we do it, and how it fits with some kind of set of principles and values, really. And I suppose that's one of the things that positive behaviour support can really help with, because it encapsulates a framework for how you should be operating, really. So I think that's kind of really important. And Herb Lovett again reinforces that when Herb said, this is a lovely book, Learning to Listen, for those of you interested in working with people with challenging behaviour, which I guess is all of you, actually, isn't it? Yeah, sometimes I might say that to an audience where it'd be mixed, but I can take that as read, really. So Herb Lovett says, there's no such thing as a value-free way of working with others. The challenge is to keep ourselves honest and to consider what values we actually use in our work, and not just the values we say we use. And I've heard people talking in the conference about the difference about, I think Sharon was saying, around compliance, and that actually people then start to present evidence of saying, yes, we do that, but when actually it's quite a different story in practice. So somebody might say, yes, we do record all incidents of handling, but if you've not had those deep negotiated discussions around what you believe handling to be, then how are you accurately recording it, really? So where do rights come into it? So what are rights? So the Children's Rights Alliance for England tells us that our human rights are the basic things we need in order to live with dignity and develop and reach our potential, such as food, housing, and healthcare, and the right to express ourselves, hold religious beliefs, and this is a particular one that interests me, and be free from violence and abuse. And in the politics of wonder, I then sit down and I start to think, ooh, what's violence? What's abuse? What's violence and abuse in the context of schools and staff? And how often do we kind of discuss that and fit those ideas into our framework? And the Children's Rights Alliance for England also tells us that we all have these rights, no matter who we are, what we are like or what we do. Nobody has to earn the human rights. We're entitled to our rights simply because we are human. And that's important to me. That's another thing that a rights-based agenda can do for us, because often disabled children are not conceptualised as human. They're conceptualised as other. And certainly when I started working with people with autism, there were none of the affordances made to them that would be to children that would be thought of as human. So I remember being in one specialist school, which I nearly named, in a part of the country, many, many years ago, and there was a little lad there that was refusing to eat. So the head, so we'd all be in the dining room, and the head would hold the child down, someone else would hold his mouth open, and the deputy would shove food in there, and they would shout, eat, 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 like this. And there was never mind what that was doing to him, how that felt to him, there was no thought given. And I was sat there, I was complicit, I was eating my food, thinking, wish she'd shout a bit quieter. That was probably usually the extent of what I was thinking. Because, but no concern was had for the impact on the other children there, and what it meant every time you had your meal to eat it in that situation, to see one of your other pupils being abused in that way. And again, it was done for the best intentions. People were worried that he wouldn't survive if they didn't do it. So it wasn't done viciously in that sense. So I'm very concerned about how we keep the humanity of disabled children, really. Okay, so I'm gonna go on a bit. Right, I'll probably go on a bit. So Herb Lovett again reinforces that, says rights are not privileges. People with difficult behaviour are constantly being told they have to earn their way to community. But it's everybody's right. That was a very powerful statement from when I read it, because that immediately made me think of children I was working with and how restricted their lives were becoming. And I was starting to think about, well, what's the impact of them? So I was thinking of one lad, David, who loved to get out of school, loved to be to be out in the community doing different things. But part of the attraction for him, if we did that, was to have access to other children that he could injure in some way. He was kind of very fixated on injuring others. So that would then created a number of situations that made us very tense. So it was always easier for us to manage to say, well, that's it. We can't go out anymore. When we go on that trip, he's not going to be able to go. And I could see his world reducing. And that really troubled me. And a child rights-based approach to child caregiving and protection requires a paradigm shift towards respecting and promoting the human dignity and the physical and psychological integrity of children as rights-bearing individuals. So I like to take these phrases and I like to give them to staff and say, in a politics of wonder, hey, what do we think about that then? How do we think that plays out in our school? And human dignity is, like in all the kind of rights treaties, is a key theme. It's so important. And what does dignity mean? How do we protect dignity? And so I apologise, I actually ought to tell you there's a couple of slides that actually sometimes I've tweeted them round and I get messages from people saying, oh, that should have come with a warning. It was too horrible. But you're not going to know, are you, unless you look now. But if you think you might. But those of you who are kind of working in ABA will think, oh, no, not that old chestnut, really, from 1965. So it's a picture of a man kind of whose face looks very angry. He looks like he's making a very angry face. He looks to me like he's shouting. And he's hitting a child around the side of the head. And the child to me just looks rigid with fear. And this was from a feature on the work of Lovas that was in Life magazine. So they've worked with the photographers, like obviously really happy for this picture to be shown around the world. There's no sense of shame or that this is a practice that shouldn't occur. And I'm not saying I'm not making a point about ABA. What I'm interested in through this politics of wonder is how was that child viewed by the world, for the world to think that that was something to celebrate. That was something to think, yes, this is the way we should be moving forward. Let's tell the world about this practice because it's something really positive. How had we got to a point where we had stopped seeing this as a child, as a frightened little boy? How had we stopped being able to read his behaviour and see the fear that was communicated there? So that's why I'm interested. So for me, that obviously is a very clear kind of breach of that child's rights. But I wonder about these pictures. And in the first picture, there's a little tot, looks like a little girl's arm to me, and there's an adult's hand, I'm going to call it a man's hand, adult male hand, who's holding it. So the little tot has got her hand up, like stretched. And it reminded me of, in Sheffield, we have a big shopping centre on the edge of Sheffield called Meadowhall. I see all the ones who do their Christmas shopping there. Yeah, and some of the locals call it Meadow Hell. That's its local name. But you quite often see children on a Saturday afternoon, and I don't know whether they were given the choice of the park or going to Doncaster Wildlife Sanctuary or Meadowhall, and they all elect to go to Meadowhall, but they spend their Saturday afternoon going from one adult clothes shop to another adult clothes shop in Meadowhall. And you see the little children. And if you I don't follow children around Meadowhall, I will have to say, but if I happen to see them several times while I'm there, and you can see them start flagging, they start to cry, and then they'll get that arm tugged as well, and the parents will say, come on, we need to get it done. And dads seem to be the worst, probably because maybe it's a height thing, but they don't seem to have any sense of what it's like to walk around with your hand up all the time, really. So I think for me, that's a practice I'd want to look at very carefully. That's a practice I would want to open up to discussion. But I've realised when I look at these pictures that they provide me with more detail than is actually there, really. So I will tell you that the next picture, and you'll be thinking, how does he know this? Has he seen it in context? But it's just in my imagination now. Is where someone is wanting to cross the road with a small child. And for some reason, the child is not comfortable about holding hands. But the child is willing to hold, to have control. For me, it's probably something about control, that the child wants to be able to control the amount and the length, probably, of the physical contact. So the child is taking control and got the finger. And I don't know if anybody has anybody been watching the A Word, which is finished now? Anybody? Oh, I loved it. I was so sad when it ended. Yeah, so it's about a family who are trying to negotiate a diagnosis of autism for their child. But there's a very similar scene where the little boy Joe, who's I think 5 in the TV series, he's picked up by a childminder, I think she was a Ukrainian lady who, as far as I'm aware, hadn't got any kind of training, certainly hadn't got any training in autism, hadn't got any childcare training. But she had that emotional intelligence that Sandra was talking about. She could read Joe. She could work out for herself from observing him what worked for him and what didn't. And so she goes to take his hand and she sees that he goes a bit rigid. So she says, oh, choose a finger, in that exact same way. And he's intrigued. It's exciting. Which finger shall I choose? Where shall I hold the finger? How shall I hold it? It obviously becomes of interest to him. And so they cross the road together. And she has all these his dad is very in tune with him too. The poor mum is made a bit of her character's made a bit of a tyrant. She wants to get him changed, made him more normal. So she's been given that role. But the dad's more into, oh, I'm going to learn his language and we're going to meet in the middle and communicate. So for me, I think that's an enabling and empowering practice, really. And that one, the first one with the hand held high, I think, for me, that's a kind of handling. For me, that's a handling. And if it's positive, who is it positive for? Because it's not positive, I don't think, from the perspective of the little child whose arm is being wrenched up. So that's another key concern for me. It's when we say positive, whose perspective are we looking at? Is it positive for us because it means that we can get on and run school like we want to run school and we don't have to do things differently? Or is it actually what's happening positive for the child because it makes them feel safer, makes them feel more secure, and in some way that they're showing it's something that they're seeking out, really? And this is important because the General Assembly, UN General Assembly, tells us that societies around the world are obligated to protect and proactively prevent all forms of violence against children. So we can hold, these treaties are great, and these mandates from the UN are great because it gives us something that we can start to hold organisations to account. We can say, look, we have to report on how we are meeting the requirements of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So we need to monitor these things, really. This is like, I'm looking at my watch. These are these things that really trouble me. It's like, at the same time I was brought up not to put the milk bottle on the table. I was like, don't look at your watch when you're talking to people. It's rude. So I kind of, in this sort of situation, I think, oh my goodness, I need to look at my watch. And then I'm thinking, Andy will be thinking Nick's not moving around enough. It was a waste of an idea about the mic. I'm quite like clutching onto this today, yeah. So, okay, so go on a bit, really. So I'm just going to go on actually to one. You might come back. Oh, no, I suppose I just want to put this one in. Is I don't want to make it all seem too simple, because some of you will be thinking, oh, that's all very well, but sometimes we have to handle, sometimes we have to intervene. And the United Nations Children's Fund and UNESCO tell us that it's a complex issue. They say adopting a rights-based approach to education is not a panacea. It does pose some challenges. For example, the need to balance the claims of different rights holders and address potential tensions between the realisation of different rights or between rights and responsibilities. But many of you will be aware of the work, the great work of Dave Hewitt. And Dave Hewitt kind of did that fantastic research project when he worked with staff at an institution for adults with learning difficulties, where they had this issue. They were saying, look, we don't want to be physically interfering with these grown adults so much. And what does it matter, really, if we're all going to go off to do some activity in the hall? Does it really matter that we get this person who doesn't want to go down that corridor in time for the activity to start? Isn't it better if we spend so much more time trying to find a way to work with this person so that they want to take themselves there? So it might be you put a trail of things that interest them so they go a bit nearer each time. I'm just making that naff idea up off the top of my head, so I don't think that was from Dave Hewitt. But one of the things he said, he came up with 10 kind of themes, really, about what did he think were the essentials for good practice. Like, in the places where he went where they did it really well, what were the 10 things they all did? And one of them I thought was really interesting is he said that they all welcomed the richness that challenging behaviour brought to their working lives. They really welcomed how it tested them, the staff as people, how it kind of brought them together around common goals, how it got them discussing things, how it enabled them to learn new insights about themselves, really. So it doesn't worry me that it's complex. I'm not worried about where we get to in terms of answers. Normally I urge people to ask the questions rather than find the answers. But Sandra kind of trumped that a bit, really, in her presentation this morning when she said, God wants us to ask questions. So I thought, well, I can't really say that's my idea now, really. So I better go with God, really. So I've talked a bit about some of the terrible things I did, so I might as well tell you some more. Why this concerns me, but years ago, again, these were in specialist provision that would go around telling other people how to do it, and they would come and visit, and this was seen as the best practice. And I lived in a hostel for people with autism for a while, and there was a young man there, it's about 19, and it would get to sometime in the afternoon, and two of the young care workers, who I think all the care workers were female, so two of the young females would say, all right then, Stephen, we need to go outside. And the hostel was on this really busy, frantic road. And they would take Stephen outside, and he would start to resist, to pull back. They would get either side of him, they'd marshal him along, and they had to go down the street and they had to press the Pelican Crossing and go, and I'd look through the window to see what was going on, and at times they'd be holding him against the wall because he'd be wanting to kind of run off and run away. And you just had to get it done. It was on his programme that he had to get used to traffic. And I kind of saw a car not so long ago parked. There's a picture there of a car parked on the pavement. And there's a picture of a cyclist riding on the pavement. And I thought, oh, yes, what is it? Like, we're very trusting, aren't we, that actually traffic will stay in those narrow little boundaries. They will actually stay on the road. And why do we think that? Because they don't always stay on the road. Sometimes they come onto the pavement. And if you haven't got, like some of that, I think we just trust that they'll stay there. But if you haven't got a system that is able to kind of work out when they'll be on the road and when they'll be on the pavement, that's just one issue you might have. You might think, well, they could come off any time and run into me. And you could be so petrified. But no one talked about that in terms of that young man being afraid. No one even thought about it. It's just because he's autistic, he's not good with traffic. And we've got to make him good with traffic. 5 minutes. Oh, yeah.
20 slides, 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Right, okay. Let's go on to why. Why do these things happen? I won't stop either. You know, you'll just have to drag me off. Yeah, don't be polite, really. So I'm like, no, I haven't finished. So I'm interested in why this happens. So I was talking about like why I use the rights agenda to really emphasise the humanity of disabled children, because Catherine Runswick-Cole from Manchester Met and Dan Goodley from the University of Sheffield, they have kind of, I suppose, created a concept of dishuman, because they're interested in how the lives of disabled people trouble this notion of human and how they make us rethink what it means to be human and to rethink about the range of ways of being in the world. And very often in my work, people just think people do things because they're autistic or because they have global developmental delay. So they don't talk about it in those terms of he did it because he was excited, or he did it because he loves it, or he did it was afraid. And everything you kind of say, so if you say something like, a friend of mine often uses this quote that really annoys her if people say about her son. If they say, what does he like? And he's would have that label of autism. What does he like? And she'll say, oh, he likes Star Wars. And the person will go, oh, yes, autistic people do. And she's like, no, he likes Star Wars because of who he is. Like, you know, don't make everything about autism. And she'll say in defense, she'll say, oh, well, his dad likes it too. And the person will look and they'll go, So, yeah. So Tom Shakespeare, because in case you thought that was William Shakespeare, had been writing about these issues that, you know, for his anniversary really, but he talks about identity spread, about how labels can take over the whole, that's all that your personality is allowed to be. And how disabled children are often considered abnormal, and those terms, they're used as disordered. So I'm really kind of anti that term. I'm always urging people to please stop using it, of autism spectrum disorder. Like it's, you know, how does that make you feel in terms of your self-esteem? To be referred to as disordered. And autistic people say, we hate that term. That's really damaging for our self-esteem. And Fiona Kamari Campbell from Australia talks about it's customary to do things to disabled children rather than with or directed by them. So we're going to miss out all the slides that cite some of our distinguished people here. So you'll see your name probably as it goes past. And hopefully I've talked about these. You know all about restraint and the problems with that, really. I'll probably just have to urge you to pay attention to the UN Convention. Because what I do is I just take some of those things, and I will finish with my conclusions. Yeah, I've got 2 minutes. So what are my conclusions? And one of the conclusions, I'm just letting you know, I do know appears twice. I honestly do read them, but I'd sent it in, so I thought it had to stay. Like some of my other presenters are real rebels, like changing them. I thought, oh no, it's got to stay as it is. So the quality of responses to behaviour is dependent upon the ability to observe, read and understand it. So one of my arguments is we've got to get much more skilled, much better at actually being able to learn people's systems. Donna Williams talks about it as the inside-out approach. She said, if you want to know about that person with autism, throw away the textbook. Just observe how that person is in the world. Observe how they engage and interact with it. And I'm sure all academics here would not endorse the throw away the textbooks. We will be like, oh, well, keep buying them, but do that as well, yeah. That some of the ways we engage with children and young people and adults negate their rights. And we'll only know when that's happening if we know what their rights are. And we discuss it and we talk about it. What's key is relationships. If we're going to know people, then we've got to have kind of consistency and time and shared communication systems so that we can share what we learn about people, really. I'm really concerned about where the problem of behaviour is seen. And in schools, the current policy in England on force and control positions the problem of behaviour within the person doing it. So it's about the person's at fault. Maybe the person needs to be excluded so it doesn't interfere with schools reaching their targets. It's not seen as actually maybe the person's doing the behaviour because of the way the school operates. Okay, and I'm just, last two, promise. It's a lot of missing out those ones in order to do that, really. Positive handling, I'm suggesting, is really a dangerous misnomer because people start to do it and they think it is positive without really thinking about what it is they're doing. And my key question, I suppose, what everybody will think whenever that's happening is actually, is the recipient at the time that we're doing it experiencing it as positive? Thank you.